Guys, if you enjoy creepy stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. And also tell where you are watching from. My name is Alex Carter, and I've always believed that the wilderness holds no fear for those who respect its power. This journey was supposed to be another test of my survival skills, a solo trek into the mountains, just me against nature's fury. The storm had come in fast, an angry wall of wind and snow that swallowed the landscape whole. I had known the risks when I set out, but I'd told myself I was prepared. I had the gear, the experience, the instincts. But out here, miles from the nearest road, under an ink-black sky swirling with white chaos, I was starting to doubt myself. My tent was the only refuge I had, a fragile bubble of nylon in a vast and indifferent wilderness. Snow had already piled high against its sides, pressing in like cold hands. The wind shrieked, rattling the fabric, shaking the poles. Inside, my breath came in visible bursts, fogging the dim glow of my lantern. I huddled deeper into my sleeping bag, listening to the storm rage. It was the kind of night that made the world feel empty, where survival felt like a fragile thing, a candle flickering in the dark. But I had done this before. I had camped in the depths of winter, braved worse storms. I told myself that morning would come, the sky would clear, and I would break camp and make my way back down the mountain. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, a break in the howling that almost sounded like footsteps. Slow, crunching through the deep snow. I sat up, straining to listen. The noise came again, closer this time. Something was moving outside my tent. A cold fear settled over me, deeper than the winter chill. I reached for my knife, my fingers numb against the handle. My mind raced through the possibilities. A wild animal? A stray hiker lost in the storm? But no one else was supposed to be out here. I had chosen this spot precisely because it was isolated. The footsteps stopped. Just beyond the thin walls of my tent, something, or someone, was standing there, listening, watching. I held my breath. The seconds stretched, heavy and thick. Then, slowly, deliberately, the thing outside my tent ran its hand, or claw, or something worse, down the fabric, a long, slow drag that sent shivers down my spine. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent in one swift motion, the beam cutting into the swirling snow. Nothing. The wind howled through the trees, kicking up white drifts that danced like ghosts in the night. My breath came fast, ragged. The snow outside my tent was untouched. No footprints, no sign of anything. I told myself it had been my imagination, a trick of the storm, my mind twisting the sounds of shifting ice and wind into something sinister. I zipped the tent shut and forced myself to lie back down, gripping my knife like a lifeline. But sleep didn't come. Hours passed. The storm didn't let up. And then, just as I began to convince myself that I had imagined it, my phone buzzed. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. No service, no Wi-Fi. Yet somehow, a message had come through. "Why did you stop looking?" My blood turned to ice. My fingers fumbled, swiping to check the number. No sender, no way to reply. My breath came shallow and fast. I wasn't alone. The snow outside my tent shifted. I heard it this time, a definite step. My heart pounded as I turned off my lantern, plunging the tent into darkness. Maybe if I was still, silent, it would go away. Then my phone buzzed again. "Come outside." I bolted upright, gripping my knife. Number no way in hell. I had heard too many stories, read too many accounts of people disappearing without a trace in the mountains. This was how it started. My brain screamed at me to run. But where? Into the storm? into the black void beyond my tent. I was trapped. I could feel my heart beat in my throat, my pulse thudding in my ears. Then something pressed against the tent again. A hand. A shape loomed outside, barely visible through the nylon. It crouched, just inches from where I sat, separated by only a thin layer of fabric. My breath hitched. I clenched the knife tighter, my palm slick with sweat despite the freezing cold. The shadow didn't move, just waited, watching. And then, with terrifying slowness, it began to unzip the tent from the outside. I didn't think. I acted. With a burst of adrenaline, I lunged forward, slashing through the fabric with my knife. A scream, human, but distorted, pierced the night as the shadow recoiled. I scrambled out into the snow, my flashlight swinging wildly. Nothing. Again, nothing. Only my own footprints disturbed the snow. The storm still raged, erasing any evidence, swallowing the world in white. But I wasn't waiting around. I grabbed my essentials and ran, abandoning the tent, stumbling through knee-deep drifts. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I didn't care about the cold biting at my face, the ice burning in my lungs. I ran until I saw the distant glow of a ranger station. I don't remember pounding on the door, don't remember collapsing inside. By the time I could speak, the storm had passed. Rangers went back with me to where I'd camped. My tent was still there, half collapsed, torn open where I had slashed it. But no prints, no signs of anything. Only my phone, lying in the snow just outside the tent. The screen was still on, a single message displayed. "You were right to run." A week passed before I could sleep again. Even then it was fitful, restless. I had left the mountain behind, but the memory of that night clung to me. Then, another message arrived. No number, no sender. "You can't hide forever." Winters in the Colorado mountains were harsh, but they had a beauty that made you forget the danger lurking beneath the ice and snow. Every year, my family made the trip to my Uncle Ron's cabin, a massive rustic lodge nestled deep in a forested valley, miles away from the nearest town. It was a weekend of snowball fights, sledding, ice fishing, and my uncle's long-winded stories about survival in the wild. Uncle Ron was a seasoned outdoorsman, the kind of guy who could build a fire in the middle of a blizzard with nothing but a pocket knife and a few sticks. My dad, while not as hardcore, enjoyed roughing it every once in a while. That year, I was 14. My younger brother Nick was 12. We're just as eager for adventure. During dinner, as the adults drank hot cider and talked about past winters, we pitched an idea that had been brewing in our heads for weeks: snow camping. We had seen survival shows, read stories about braving the elements, and figured, how hard could it be? A night out in the woods, sleeping under the stars, proving we could handle the cold. It sounded like the perfect challenge. Our dads thought it was a fantastic idea, a rite of passage for any kid growing up in the mountains. Our moms, however, were skeptical. "It's too cold," my mom insisted. "What if the storm picks up overnight?" "They'll be fine," Uncle Ron assured her. "We'll set them up not even a quarter mile from the cabin. They'll have all the gear they need. It'll be good for them." That was enough to settle the debate. By late afternoon, as the sky dimmed behind thickening gray clouds, we packed up our gear and trekked out to a clearing just beyond a frozen creek. Snow piled high on either side of the path, muffling the sound of our boots crunching through the icy ground. Uncle Ron helped us set up the tent, showing us how to reinforce the stakes and use the packed snow as insulation. "The trick is to never let yourself get too cold," he explained, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Once you're freezing, it's hard to warm up again. Keep moving if you have to." We took his words to heart as we finished setting up camp. The tent was large enough to fit all four of us comfortably, with thick sleeping bags rated for extreme cold. Before heading back to the cabin, our dads double-checked everything, made sure our flashlights worked, and left us with a walkie-talkie in case of an emergency. "You boys got this," my dad said with a grin. "Just don't go making snow monsters out there." The four of us laughed and settled in for the night. At first, it was fun. We played cards by flashlight, told stories, and laughed at how dramatic our moms had been. Snow flurries drifted down outside, and the wind whispered through the trees like a distant voice calling across the valley. Every now and then, we'd hear the distant crack of ice shifting on the lake, a deep, eerie sound that echoed through the woods. We joked about it, saying it was the ice beast waking up. Around midnight, the real storm hit. The wind roared through the trees, shaking the branches and sending flurries of snow cascading onto our tent. The temperature had dropped drastically, and despite our layers, the cold seeped through. That's when we heard it. At first, it was just a crunch in the snow. We all froze, eyes locked on one another, ears straining against the howling wind. "Probably a deer," I whispered, though my breath was shaky. Another crunch. Closer this time. "Could be Uncle Ron checking on us," Tyler murmured, but even he didn't sound convinced. The footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. Not the scattered movements of an animal, but the careful steps of someone or something approaching. Then it stopped, right behind the tent. The fabric shifted slightly as if something had brushed against it. I felt my heart pounding against my ribs, the air in the tent thick with silence. We barely breathed, waiting, listening. Then came the worst part. A long, slow exhale. It was just behind us, separated only by a thin layer of fabric. I felt Nick grab my arm, his fingers ice cold with fear. Evan whimpered but quickly clamped his hand over his mouth. Tyler just stared, wide-eyed, at the back of the tent where the sound had come from. And then, something dragged its hand across the tent. The fabric rippled under the pressure, a slow, deliberate motion, like fingertips tracing along the surface. Nick was the first to break. "We have to go." I reached for the tent zipper with trembling hands, yanked it down, and we burst out into the freezing night. The wind howled around us, snow whipping against our faces as we ran, stumbling, half falling through the knee-deep snow. Behind us, the footsteps followed. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Faster now, as if whatever had been stalking us was no longer interested in staying hidden. My breath burned in my chest, my legs heavy with exhaustion. The warm glow of the cabin lights flickered in the distance, barely visible through the storm. "Run! Run!" I screamed, my voice swallowed by the wind. Nick tripped, and Tyler grabbed him, hauling him back up. We could hear it closing in. Then, just as we reached the clearing, the scream. A shrill, bone-chilling sound cut through the storm, something between a human cry and an animal's wail. We didn't dare look back. We reached the cabin porch, threw open the door, and crashed inside. Everyone was already awake, startled by our screaming and the sound of the storm. Our parents rushed to us, demanding to know what had happened. Shaking and breathless, we told them everything. Uncle Ron and my dad exchanged a glance, grabbed their rifles, and headed out. They were gone for nearly half an hour. When they returned, their faces were pale. "We didn't see anyone," my dad said, "but there were tracks, big ones, leading up to your tent, but none leading away." The next morning, when the storm had passed, we returned to retrieve our things. The tent was still standing, half buried in snow. But the most disturbing part? The snow around it was disturbed, marked by deep footprints circling the tent, over and over again, as if someone had been watching, waiting. None of us ever camped in the snow again. And to this day, I still don't know what was out there. But I do know one thing. It wasn't human. It was 2 years ago when James and his father, Robert, set out on what was supposed to be another peaceful camping trip. They had been doing this for years, escaping from the noise of everyday life, trading the hum of the city for the rustling of leaves and the crackle of a campfire. There was something about being out in nature, away from responsibilities, that made these trips feel almost sacred. This time, they chose a campsite deep in the countryside, a place known for its scenic beauty, winding hiking trails, and even a few adventure activities like ziplining. But there was something else about this land, an older, quieter history. The area had once belonged to a Native American tribe, and while much of that history had been paved over with tourist attractions, there was an energy that still lingered beneath the surface. The first night was perfect. Families sat around their campfires, their laughter mixing with the distant chirping of crickets. The glow of flickering flames painted shadows against the trees, and the smell of roasting marshmallows filled the cool night air. James and Robert did what they always did: cooked hot dogs, shared a couple of beers, and made easy conversation with fellow campers. Everything felt normal. But the second night was different. That morning, a park staff member casually mentioned that they were the only ones left in the campground. No other sites had been booked. What had initially felt like a social, welcoming space now felt eerily empty. At first, James and Robert saw it as a rare luxury. Having the entire place to themselves meant uninterrupted quiet. No noisy neighbors, just them and the wilderness. They spent the day fishing, hiking at a leisurely pace, and even listened to a horror podcast by the river, chuckling at how they were willingly adding to the eerie atmosphere. As the sun dipped below the horizon, however, an uneasy feeling settled in. The air felt heavier, almost charged. The sky held on to twilight longer than it should have, the colors muted and unnatural. James caught his father frowning at the horizon. "Something feels off," Robert murmured, "like we're stuck in a dream." James nodded, feeling it too. The forest stretched endlessly, darker than it had been the night before, as if the trees had moved closer. A strange pressure built in his chest, like they were being watched. He told himself it was just his imagination. Back at their campsite, they clung to the fire, its warmth and light a welcome distraction. They didn't speak about their unease, no need to. It was an unspoken agreement to keep things normal. They roasted marshmallows, played music on a Bluetooth speaker, and even smoked a little weed to relax. But the feeling lingered. Then, around 9 p.m., it started. A bang. Loud, sudden, close. It sounded like a massive tree had crashed down by the river, only 100 yards away. James and Robert exchanged glances, grabbing their flashlights and scanning the darkness. But there was nothing. No movement, no glowing eyes. Just the thick void of the night. They forced a laugh, joking about Bigfoot, though neither of them really believed it. Then, another bang. Farther away this time, but just as deep, just as heavy. It wasn't the sound of an animal moving through the woods. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as if something was testing them. They shined their lights into the trees, but the beams barely cut through the dense blackness. Then the third bang. Closer. Their laughter died. The fire crackled between them, its light suddenly feeling too small, too fragile. The noise was circling them. James felt his pulse quicken, his breath coming shorter. The fourth bang. This one was only 20 yards away. The earth trembled beneath them, and all the effects of the weed were gone in an instant. James saw his father's expression, tight-lipped, pale. Whatever was out there, it was coming for them. Without a word, they moved. James threw more wood onto the fire, making the flames jump higher. desperate for the light to push back the darkness. Then they bolted for the tent, leaving everything else behind. Inside, James flattened himself to the ground, his heart hammering. Robert zipped the entrance shut and sat by it, gripping their only weapon, a small hunting knife, useless against whatever was lurking outside. Then the loudest bang yet. Robert went still. "It's right there," he whispered. James swallowed hard. "What is?" "I don't know," Robert admitted, his voice barely above a breath. "It's like a wall of darkness." Neither of them moved. Outside the tent, the night had gone completely silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Then came the strangest thing of all. A vibration filled the air, not just a sound, but a pressure. A deep, resonant hum that pressed against their chests, making it hard to breathe. James felt it in his bones. Robert whispered, "Do you hear that?" James nodded, too afraid to speak. Then, a noise unlike anything either of them had ever heard. A growl. But not from any animal they knew. It was guttural, distorted, alien. The closest thing James could compare it to was the Demogorgon from Stranger Things. But this was real. Too real. James clenched his fists, forcing himself not to look out the mesh window beside him. He didn't want to see it. He couldn't. And then, nothing. No memory of falling asleep. No recollection of the thing leaving. Just blackness. When James woke up, his father was still clutching the knife, his back against the tent entrance. James shot upright, panic surging through him. His first instinct was to check his phone. Dead. Robert checked his. Also dead. Both had been fully charged the night before. They stepped outside cautiously, backs against each other as they relieved themselves, still on edge. The air was colder than it should have been. The untouched food sat where they had left it. The fire, which should have burned for hours, was nothing but dead ashes. The entire campsite felt wrong. They didn't speak as they packed up, their movements mechanical, efficient. Only when they were inside the car, speeding down the dirt road back toward civilization, did Robert finally break the silence. "You felt it too, didn't you?" James swallowed hard and nodded. "Like we were being watched, hunted." They never went back to that campsite. In fact, they never went camping again. And whatever was out there that night, whatever was lurking just beyond the firelight, they never saw it. Not fully. But Robert had seen enough to know one thing. It wasn't human, and it wasn't natural.